This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the USS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. Well, we haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and joining me this week is Trek FM's design supremo and host of Saturday Morning Trek, Aaron Harvey. Hi Aaron, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing fantastic, thank you.
Oh, good. Well, it's good to have you on board this week because I'm basically regular listeners will know I'm kind of holding the fort while Tony's away on an extended bout of shore leave. and the topic I wanted to discuss this week is something that really I'm not very well equipped to talk about. We're going to talk about design in the various Star Trek series because our remit on Primitive Culture is kind of looking at history, looking at culture. And so far we've been focusing on that more in terms of literature and history and film and so on. But really, you know, we want that to be as broad as possible. And obviously visual culture and graphic design and these kind of things are a big part of what has always made Star Trek interesting and vivid and exciting to people and a big part of what's made the show so iconic. So I thought there was no better person to join me really to talk about this than you, Aaron, since you are a designer, you're responsible for some amazing works of design that everyone who listens to Trek FM will be familiar with. So I'm hoping that you will have more of the vocabulary to kind of explain what these things are that I kind of look at as a layperson and struggle to make sense of.
Well, you know, Mike Okuda or Rick Sternbach, they might have been better choices, but
oh well,
they're a little busy.
I expect so. Yeah. I mean, what I was keen to do. Is probably we'll just kind of go through the various series and look at some of the kind of design issues that have cropped up over the 50-year history of Star Trek. So obviously going back right to the beginning, it was Matt Jefferies really who was the guy who I suppose was responsible initially for a lot of what we think of as the look of Star Trek. And I was quite interested to discover that Matt Jefferies was a pilot like Gene Roddenberry. He flew the B-17 bombers in the Second World War, which Gene Roddenberry did as well. So they kind of had that in common. And I think when he came to the job of designing the original Enterprise, he was kind of bringing some of that sort of aeronautical expertise with him. Yeah,
definitely. And when you think about it, it feels very Air Force. I mean, even basically what they would call the Star Trek logo or the Flying A, which is the Delta shield. Which it's interesting. I've talked to a bunch of people and no one's really sure where that logo and that idea came from, what direction, created the Starfleet Delta. But I know that nobody really, that story never seemed to have gotten captured. But if you look at a lot of the design from the era for airlines, Air Force, space, anything, that shape is sort of ubiquitous. It's just everywhere. There's, I think there was Allegheny Airlines, a local East Coast airline, had a logo that was really similar. There is, which now the term would not fly, pun intended. Northwest Orient Airlines, if you look at their logo from the 40s, looks like a Star Trek badge. It's kind of uncanny. Yeah, we always joke that it was like, oh, did he get some sort of endorsement from the company? And there's also a piece of telecommunication equipment from, I believe it was the late 30s, that's used in the pilot in the conference room, and they've sort of removed the phone dial off of it, so it looks futuristic and it's got some buttons and things. But the logo for that is called like amplitude or amplicall. That's what it was. It was like a call center sort of thing. The A has the curved A
kind of
and
arch.
a star in it. Yeah, I mean, it looks exactly like the command delta. So we're like, did it come from that? Because they just happened to see the instruction manual. And like, ooh, that A. And they called it the flying A internally. So I'm like,
did they? Right.
If you look at the astrogator, which is the disc in the middle that they use to navigate, it's really similar to a plotting device used in World War II airplanes.
Right.
So,
right.
And it's funny because my grandfather, I come from an aeronautical family. My grandfather worked at Lockheed, and he always joked that it's like it's already outdated. You know, I remember this as a kid. He was just like, "That's not futuristic. That's just like spinning dials." It's like, you know, even now we have computers to do this, which is funny because now when you think about what the computers would have been in the 1970s, they'd still be gigantic compared to what we have now.
Yeah.
But back then, he was even saying that it didn't quite match, you know, real aeronautical technology.
But yet to the average viewer at home, it seems futuristic and it has that kind of feel. It's interesting what you're saying about the Delta Shield because I always sort of assume the Delta Shield that it's basically like a star with the two top points cut off, but I suppose it's also got that rounded aspect to it. They're not straight lines, they're these curved lines, and I guess that was a big part of the design of the original ship compared to, I mean, something we might we will, I hope, come back to later is, you know, talking about bringing it right up to date, Discovery, which has those kind of sharp triangular sort of lines in it. But the original Enterprise, very round, very kind of cylindrical, very much that kind of like an aircraft, like a, you know, sort of jumbo jet style design, rather than like sort of commercial aircraft, rather than a sort of more military style design in some ways. That's that kind of suggestion. And also the colouring, the fact that it's very plain, that it's very white, that it's kind of, you know, it's sort of gleaming. It does seem very much like a sort of desirable form of transportation rather than something, if you think, I suppose, you know, jumping forward, but also jumping back, like the NX-01, which is, you know, seems much more metallic and kind of more gritty in a sense, whereas the original Enterprise has that kind of very smooth, very contoured kind of design.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because Matt Jefferies had to fight for that. Basically, everybody wanted something to be on the hull, like to have texture, to have it details. And he said he wanted to keep that smooth, you know, streamlined thing, not because it was streamlined because it needed to fly into an atmosphere, but because everything would be internalized. It's in space. You wouldn't have anything exposed necessarily. And it allowed for interesting lighting effects where you could have reflection of color and light from planets and stars. And even though we might not really have seen that fully realized in the television show, a lot of the early sketches show these really interesting highlights and colors on the hull. So it was supposed to be... I almost wondered if at one point in his thinking that it might have been even a little bit more metallic, like even more reflective, because it did end up being a little bit more dull. And that's kind of interesting because when we talk about the motion picture, they went into a more pearlescent sort of coating that caused the Enterprise to be a lot more reflective and shimmering. Right.
I mean, I guess another aspect of that design is it does seem quite aerodynamic. I mean, even if it isn't meant to operate in an atmosphere, just because of the shape and the nacelles and the kind of sweeping aspect, I mean, it almost looks a bit like a bird gliding or something, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? It doesn't exactly have wings, but it has a kind of suggestion of wings in the design structure of it that kind of, you know, maybe consciously or not, makes you think of that kind of creature gliding through the air.
Well, if you go back and look at the progression of the design, it started out sort of looking at what was popular at the time and was considered, you know, the modern drama of science fiction was Lost in Space. So there was sort of this, started with a saucer idea, and Gene was sort of like, no, let's not do a saucer. And his original, this is about as detailed as Gene got, apparently. It was, no rocket, no flames, no smoke. And it was a lot of, I don't know what I want, but I know what I don't want. So, and talking with another designer who worked on the animated series, that seems to be sort of his MO. It was like very little information up front, just bring me stuff and I'll tell you when it's right.
Right.
So
it's what people always say about art, isn't it? I don't know much about art, but I know what I like. It's that kind of,
Yeah, but those people aren't good art directors. That's the problem. Like
yeah.
A good creative director and art director will have that opinion, but be able to express roughly what they're looking for. They think,
Sure.
sometimes you can't. I understand that, but it seems like maybe he might not have been the best person to always be giving direction to the designers.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, this is in the very, very early stages. There was no design team or anything at this point. It was Gene and Matt Jefferies talking. But he came back with sort of a saucer-like thing. They changed that. The next step is what eventually becomes the Daedalus class ship, is the sphere instead of the saucer in the front, and much more cylindrical, like kind of a cylinder body for the secondary hull, and then sort of the nacelles off of it. And possibly in between those steps was the ring ship that you end up seeing in the motion picture, which is sort of like two big rings in the center column. So it's like they did play with those shapes, which I think are a lot more interesting and probably more realistically space-based.
Yeah.
But I think it was just there was a lack of beauty, maybe, was or...
They're not sort of heroic in the same way. Do you know what I mean? It's that kind of...
Yeah. It was lacking a screen presence.
Yeah, and character, really I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and the ship became as much of a character as Spock or Kirk or anyone. And so he basically took that, the Daedalus sphere, and squished it down. And then he goes, it was funny because at the end we ended up with a saucer on the ship anyway. Even though it wasn't just the saucer, but it was like, you have a saucer. And it's weird when you think about it. If you described that to somebody, it does not sound like it would come together well. Like you've got a cylinder with two things sticking off of it that look like rockets off the back, and then a saucer in the front of the ship. And you're just like, that doesn't sound good. And you look at it and it the balance works out, and it looks pretty decent. It's one of those things that it actually has really good angles from pretty much however you look at it,
and
which isn't easy.
Is even malleable to an extent, insofar as, I mean, you said it's a character throughout the whole of Star Trek, and it is in a sense, because that ship design, I mean, however radically certain ships have tried to depart from it, that is the basic kind of underlying ship design of all the Federation starships, pretty much, that we've seen. And sometimes there'll be one exactly. Yeah. I mean, sometimes there'll be one that pushes it a bit, that breaks some of those rules. Apparently, Gene Roddenberry had certain rules about, the two nacelles had to be able to see each other, and there had to be, a certain amount of space here, and so on. Which I'm sure the Defiant, for example, would have broken his rules. Yeah, but broadly speaking, you can recognise you recognise a Federation starship immediately. It's got that kind of that shape to it and that kind of feel to it, which is almost like a character kind of working all the way through. And I guess, and did look different to anything that people had seen at the time. I read that one of the reasons for the nacelles was actually a kind of quite practical idea, that because the engines would have to be, the sort of force of the engines would have to be so powerful in order to go faster than the speed of light and so on. The idea was to kind of separate them away from the hull of the ship, that you wouldn't want them to be in the way that the Defiant is. They're kind of stuck on the side, that they would sort of be pushed away. I don't know, I suppose almost because they're overheating so much, or because they're kind of, some sort of, a bit like some sort of rocket-like idea, that you're kind of keeping them slightly at arm's length.
I'd imagine it has something to do with maybe radiation as well, or something. Whatever field it's generating, some sort of,
dangerous,
like the warp field might have electromagnetic. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's funny because it's, a couple 100 feet away. It's not really that far away.
Yeah.
It's, it's far enough, and it's also, if something happens to them, they can be jettisoned.
Right. Yeah.
You can just basically pop the nacelle off, and we talked about, I can't remember which podcast we were talking about, but doing saucer separation. You never saw it, but they did mention in the original series that it was possible for that to happen. It wasn't like in TNG where then the saucer could fly back in and just stick back on the ship and fly away. It would have to go to space dock, and they would have to like physically reattach it. But during, I believe it was the Apple, he mentions to the crew that it's like, if something happens, separate the drive system or section and get the saucer away.
And the weird thing is, I sort of feel like it's only when you see, it's only when you get to like encounter at Farpoint and they do separate the saucer that you actually, or for me anyway, that you realise that it's a flying saucer. Do you know what I mean? Because I think that kind of, that design, it feels so connected and so kind of smooth and so much like it's part of a whole, that until you actually see it separate. And I always feel it looks really weird. I mean, especially like the star drive section without the saucer suddenly looks very ugly and kind of wrong. Do you know what I mean? And it's I mean, so it has incorporated that kind of flying saucer element, which of course is so associated with
lose
space
the balance
and so on
when you do that.
Exactly.
You don't have there's like all this back weight, and then it's just sort of like this tiny little front. Well, which is funny because it's space and it doesn't matter. But
well, that's the thing, isn't it? And I suppose that's the kind of contradiction. And obviously, you do get, say, when you get to the Borg cube or something like that, you get a kind of a real recognition that this is space and aerodynamics are totally irrelevant. But at the same time, for humans, for Starfleet, for this kind of, and maybe it is partly because it's a kind of military organisation, whether it's a sort of naval organisation or kind of Air Force organisation or however you see that. And there is a lot of emphasis on people as pilots, on the skill of the pilot and so on. So I think that all kind of ties into it. Tony and I have talked about that before in relation to Gene Roddenberry's experience in the Second World War. But definitely there's that kind of aeronautical feel on the outside. Just thinking about the inside of the ship as well. I mean, one of the things that really distinguished the original series, I think, at the time, was the use of colour. And it's interesting going back to the cage. The cage was much more muted, but then when they came around to kind of developing the original series and getting into, I think Where No Man Has Gone Before is a bit more colourful, but then particularly after that, once you get into the kind of regular run of the series, you get, not just in the costuming, but also in the design of the sets and so on. I think they repainted the bridge, right, to kind of bring a lot more colour into it.
I'm literally looking at a picture of that as you said that. It was kind of funny. And I really like the original bridge in the pilot because, like you said, it has the more muted tones, which doesn't become as dated as quickly. It feels more pseudo-military / it just feels more functional and less civilian, I guess would be the word I'm looking for. Right. And it also has different monitors and more going on than the more streamlined final version. It has the gooseneck lamps on it too, which are a little goofy looking. Yeah. Take those out. And like, I think there could have been, there's the whole idea that, color television was just coming out, so we want to make everything colorful. I honestly don't know how much of that really played a role. I mean, it kind of became the story, but I think it became the story after they saw that NBC had high-rated shows that were in color, and then they started like, oh, we'll just take our shows and we'll use that to promote color, not necessarily sell televisions, but then RCA went and made an ad with Star Trek that said, oh, look at this fantastic show in color. So I don't know how much feedback from the network that they got to make the show colorful,
make it as colorful, or if they did it
of their own accord. Yeah.
But they did find, though, that the show rated better in households that had colour TV, didn't they, I think? So people who had colour TVs were more... I mean, I suppose they didn't have that much choice of what to watch. It's kind of like if you've got a 3D TV, you're going to go and buy Avatar, even if you don't particularly love the film or whatever. I mean, there's an element of kind of.
No, I'm not going to do that. I will skip the 3D
maybe you're
TV.
Not.
Thank you.
No, me too. But I mean, there's an element of like the drama and the technology kind of syncing up in some way. And I mean, Avatar's a good example. I think people, I saw that film at the cinema and was completely blown away by it. But since then, I've had no desire to go. have no interest in watching the next 6 or 7 Avatar movies.
No one does. They're building an Avatar land that makes no sense.
Crazy.
Sorry,
crazy.
If you've seen my Facebook page, that's a personal thing. It's like, and I know Neville Page, the guy who designed like all the creatures, and
right.
He is equally like, it's like no one's clamoring for another Avatar. So,
but if you can get that experience of that kind of wow factor that you got when you saw Avatar each time, I mean, I don't know how they can possibly do that every time, but I suppose that then maybe there is something to that, and and maybe that was a big part of the original series for the people who did have colour TVs. There'd been nothing like this before. It is very bright. And I think also the fact that it did well later on in syndication, the fact that it's stayed so iconic, is maybe there is something a bit kind of sort of kitsch about it. There is something a bit over the top about the design. Whether that's the bright colours or the lighting. I mean, the lighting design in the original series is completely bonkers. But one of the things I was reading was actually one reason for that was because they found it was cheaper to, rather than repaint walls when they were building different sets, basically just use the same walls and then light them with different colours. So the lighting becomes therefore, I suppose, sort of richer, more... It's very theatrical, I guess. It's the kind of lighting that you would see on a theatre stage that is not naturalistic.
There's very much the idea of theatre, and people, have made the comparison that, like, you arrive on the stage, which is the transporter pad, and, you've got... It all feels very much like Shakespeare is, of course, obviously spread throughout the show, but it has that very, live theater kind of feel to it at times. And you look at the planets and they do the same thing with the sky, and they change the color there and throw a couple different rocks on, and, it's still the same planet. So, I think that's a really good description.
I mean, they did make the most, I think, in terms of, say, the costume design and so on is very colourful as well. Because, I mean... You, Aaron, you're our expert on the animated series. In the animated series, there's a lot of kind of controversy about, was one of the designers colourblind? Why have we got pink tribbles? Why have we got these kind of wacky colour schemes? But
we answered that question.
But actually, in the original series as well, if you look at, say, the Romulans in Balance of Terror, they've got these bright purple sashes. There's kind of wild colour going on that is really... is not what you'd expect in that kind of military environment. It's definitely, it stands out.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. It was also the 60s. I mean, that you kind of have to look at the greater time period. It's like, I would be really interested to see in some sort of parallel universe what Star Trek 2 or Star Trek Phase 2, which we call it now, would have been like, a late 1970s Star Trek. I mean, that could have looked like Logan's Run television show or Space 1999, which was very muted. There's like, I really would have been curious to see how that decade influenced the look, because we get to the motion picture and you kind of get a little bit of that, but I feel like it was sort of existed in its own bubble in some ways because it was very influenced by the director and 2001, and it was very much a science fiction film, and I think it wasn't as heavily influenced by the 1970s as a television show would have been. Right.
You mean because it was playing into this kind of cinematic idea of the future?
I mean, it's still 70s looking if you look at the clothing and parts, but I think we would have just, if we saw a rec deck that was not, just Decker and Ilea sitting there playing a shuffleboard game or something, that could have been really interesting. Like some of the sketches showed like crazy colors and weird, like biomorphic plants and stuff like that. So it would have been a television scale too. So they would have had to have been more just kind of inventive about what they were going to do with the money that they had.
There's a sense of scale to it as well. I mean, if you think about the rec room and so on in the motion picture, just like the height of the ceilings, you get much more of a sense of this is a big ship. There's this kind of grandeur about it that ties in with it's not just the grandeur of space, it's also the grandeur of the ship itself. And it's much more comfortable feeling and much more kind of, the fact that they are going around basically in pajamas, it makes it feel like it's a sort of, not a cozy environment, but in a sort of sterile, but, pleasant. It's like a sort of pleasant hospital or something. Do you know what I mean? Like a very...
It's funny you mentioned the pajamas because Robert Wise said the first thing he changed when he came to that movie was how the Star Trek uniforms looked, because he didn't want it to look like the TV show because it looked like they were wearing pajamas. So he traded
amazing.
one type of pajamas
One
for
kind of
other
pajamas for another. Yeah. I don't feel they look like I think they look a bit more like kind of dentists. I mean, particularly McCoy obviously has that kind of shiny blue. He really looks like a dentist uniform. But
it just felt like t-shirt and pants. I mean, it didn't.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, they weren't t-shirts, but I mean, it had that sort of like more casual. You know, I don't know. I know they always joke about in TNG like they look like bellboys or something like that. You know, which I guess that does look more like a bellboy outfit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or even in the 80s movies, but. No, I don't think that... I always liked the Admiral's uniform. I thought that was, in the motion picture, one of my favorite just overall uniforms in all of Star Trek, just because it just had a kind of a slimming effect on the side. It just was tailored really nicely. The white worked really well with the darker kind of... It looks gray on screen, but it's sort of a greenish gray. I really liked the scale in the motion picture, and I felt like the motion picture was the first time when I saw it that I felt I knew what the ship was supposed to be sized, how it was supposed to be sized.
Right.
But when you watch the TV show, you don't get a sense of scale. No. I mean, you kind of can if you think, okay, the shuttle bay, that's the shuttle fits in here. But even that isn't 100% correct. It was never really scaled properly sometimes. So you have kind of the way the Galileo was drawn and then how it was actually built scale-wise is not exactly the same. So if you look at a lot of the plans and drawings, the measurements don't quite match what happens on screen. So,
right.
I mean, now this has been 50 years. Everybody has like narrowed that thing down to within the millimeter, except nobody really knows where the engine room is, which is funny.
Oh, really?
It's been mentioned. Okay. Yeah, Trek Yards did a show a little while ago where they talked about where is the engine room, because you hear people mention that it's in the main saucer section at the back of the saucer towards the, I guess where Kirk's like that observation lounge was in the motion picture, kind of back that way. I'm just like, that doesn't sound right. And Andrew Probert put it in the engineering section, because engineering would make sense to have engineering there at the zenith of where the two struts come together. And actually one strut on the left goes into the other side, and they sort of like cross where they connect or something. But that seems to make the most sense, like right behind the shuttle bay. Yeah. Although I don't know if you'd want your engine room by the shuttle bay either. So there's a lot of weird places but there's a secondary engineering. It's just, but they've mentioned it on the show in more than one place, so there's no real canon explanation for where it is, which is sort of an interesting for a group of people when they put it together who are very specific. I mean, compared to a lot of science fiction shows from that era, there's a lot of detail. Even if it does seem a little silly now, and we always wonder why didn't they keep track of this? It's like, I doubt that the people from Lost in Space put this much thought into the Jupiter 2, or any other science fiction. Maybe the what was the submarine show from the 60s, the Fantastic Voyage, right? That sub might have actually had blueprints and stuff, but I think that they did a lot for what the time period was.
So then I guess the next real big design change in the sense came with the Wrath of Khan, and I think a lot of that came from Nick Meyer. He had quite strong feelings really about the look of the motion picture. If you read his book, which, as I've said many times on this podcast, I highly recommend. It's a very interesting, very entertaining book. He talks quite a bit about this, and he says basically he doesn't want to be one of those people kind of knocking the motion picture, because actually he thought it was a good film, but he very much felt he wanted to rebel against it. He kind of wanted to do everything differently. And the design was a big element of that. He says, this is a quote, he says, "I rebelled against the look of Wise's film. For all I know, life aboard spaceships in the future will look bland and comfortable, but in my opinion, it didn't look interesting." And he describes he says the first Star Trek movie dealt in soft pastels. Doubtless the notion was that the spaceships of the future would be user-friendly environments where people could walk around in modified tracksuits. But in my opinion, however accurate such prognostications were, the look was visually unexciting. I wanted something gritty, the look of a destroyer or even a submarine. And he talks about going, he goes on a tour of the set because they're reusing a lot of the old sets. And he said he wanted some of these kind of blinking, flashing lights. And someone said to him, okay, that's fine, we can do that, but you've just spent $50,000 of your budget. And basically he realised that that there were limitations to how much he could change things. But within that, he seemed to manage to change a lot.
Thankfully.
Yeah, I know. Well, I don't know. He said ideally he'd have liked to sort of build the Enterprise from scratch, and it would have looked more like the Nostromo in Alien, like really kind of grungy and gritty and dark and so on, which would have been a totally different
that's
look,
what you think of when you think of Star Trek, is grungy and gritty, and I'm sorry, but he was just wrong.
Well,
I know that everybody falls on their knees and loves, the Wrath of Khan and stuff. It's like, he had an exit sign in one of the scenes from, like, the 20th century. There was at one point like a digital clock. It was just which one is a nightmare for editing, because the clock has to be the same, and it can't just jump around. And anyway. No, I on a fundamental level disagree with his design sense. It was interesting. And this happened when I first saw the movie, because we went and saw it, and I was like, what the hell happened to the uniforms? I mean, they didn't have to be as bland as they were in the motion picture, but they turned into old people sweaters.
I love those uniforms. I can't believe you don't like that. You don't like the monster maroon uniforms.
Who walked out and said, Mom, Dad, it's like, are they wearing sweaters because they're old now?
Well,
it's interesting, because if you look at the actors for the age that they were for the average, summer blockbuster stuff, the cast of Star Trek was older and then continued to get older. But they did. They looked like they were wearing space sweaters or cardigans or whatever.
I love those uniforms. I mean, I know Nick Meyer said he was going for the sort of nautical feel, and I guess you get that with the kind of breast, the breast that rips open, and the fact that they look very warm compared to compared to the previous. Well, I know you think
space is cold, but not like
sweating
in the ship.
Yeah, but then we get the same thing, don't we? Later with the Deep Space Nine, with the First Contact uniforms, they must be boiling. They've got about 6 layers on underneath that. They're ripping them off layer after layer after layer after layer.
At least
they do. Yeah,
they don't. They don't look.
They're not bulky in the same way.
Cumbersome and bulky. Yeah. I felt like they sort of had the same problem that the TNG Romulan uniforms had, that look
right. Yeah.
With the huge shoulder pads and everything, look like they're wearing fabric samples or something like that. And I don't know. I felt that it went into this weird submarine design. It's like, if you take the original series, you go to the motion picture, and then you go to the Next Generation, that's a logical design progression.
That's Gene Roddenberry design, isn't it? That's the kind of evolved humanity of the future design, and the films kind of get sidetracked, I guess.
But the films in between don't visually match. It's interesting how people say, oh, Discovery is so, tonally different and stuff like that. I'm sorry. The Wrath of Khan through First Contact is visually... Well, maybe First Contact is starting to... Not First Contact, sorry. Undiscovered Country. It's
right.
Like, that's starting to kind of maybe get there. But still, the uniforms, what they did with the ships, all this stuff, it did not follow the progression that it seemed like would lead you to the Next Generation. Like, I'm curious to see where in between the space sweaters and the bellboy uniforms, what in between step besides that one random cadet uniform we'll see from time to time, which sort of looks like of an in between stage. But it feels like whatever leap was made between the end of TAS and the beginning of the motion picture, that leap was made somewhere at the end of whatever the design style is for the movies and the beginning of the Next Generation.
Yeah.
But it's a leap we never see.
But we see Picard in Jack Crusher, don't we? In basically the movie, in the Monster Maroon uniforms,
right.
But without the collar, I think. So it's kind of slightly modified.
It's sort of like they've modified it. Yeah, exactly.
But it's basically the same thing. Well, it's interesting. One of the things, I mean, talking about Nick Meyer, when because I was looking at some pictures from some of the movies, and one of the things I noticed, which I'd never really picked up on before, is there's this kind of, because they're running at the same time, the later movies are running at the same time, well, the last 2 movies anyway, are running at the same time as Next Gen, there's this kind of back and forth. So you get Nick Meyer brings in this much sort of grittier look, a lot more metallic and so on. Then you get with Next Gen, you get this carpeted bridge. Star Trek V, you get a carpet on the bridge of the Enterprise A, and then Star Trek VI, Nick Meyer obviously rips it out again, and you get this kind of metal deck plating. So there's this real kind of tug of war.
You can, I think, you can see like the glue from the carpet.
Really, right?
In the I think that's what they. Yeah.
So it's definitely, there's a kind of battle going on there, and I suppose really Nick Meyer's approach to Star Trek is almost the opposite of the Next Gen approach to Star Trek. It's like they couldn't be more at variance. That kind of battle between these kind of lofty ideals on the one hand, and the Kirk who's expressing his kind of racist attitudes or his kind of, do you know what I mean? There's a connection between design and also the way that he's treating the characters. And Nick Meyer, very much treats them as flawed people. He doesn't think that just because they're the heroes that they have to always behave impeccably. It's and it's the same kind of thing that we hear at the moment about Discovery. Are they going to stick to these kind of lofty ideals, or are they going to kind of break the mold? Which of the rules of the Roddenberry box are going to be, adhered to or broken? And I suppose the design gives you kind of clues into that.
Well, it's interesting how everybody has their own vision of what Star Trek is, and then a lot of those people, I think, sometimes compared to, from what I've seen with other franchises, a lot of those people who were fans or really enjoy it then later become people who work on the show. And so they bring their own conception of what they want Star Trek to be. I don't think Nick Myers is one of those people. I think he didn't have any knowledge about Star Trek before. Yeah, exactly.
I think he thought it was a bit of an ordeal having to sit through some old episodes as research for the Rutherford.
But you get a lot of people, at least from the design perspective, that are fans. Then they take their, like you're saying with Discovery. Right now we have John Eves and Scott Snyder who have been working on the Discovery, and they used a reference, which I believe this is probably Brian Fuller's doing to start with, referencing going back to a design that was used for, or was conceived for, Planet of the Titans, which was a movie that was never made started like in 1975 and got canned about July of 77, I think it was. And it was Ken Adam from James Bond fame and Ralph McQuarrie from Star Wars who put together this design, and it was for a reimagined movie version of the Enterprise. It was a very triangular base, big, huge, like flight deck in the back, saucer section. And it's interesting because it really depends on which version you see, because there were a lot of sketches that were all roughly the same, but you have varying heights of the nacelles where people are just like, oh, this breaks the rule. I'm like, it does, but turn the page and see the other design that doesn't break the rule. So it never got to the point where they did anything but a paper model. So it's interesting because it was like a starting point. So it wasn't. They didn't literally copy the design. And I know a lot of people are like, "Oh, they're using this failed design." Blah, blah. The design wasn't failed. The movie just was shelved before that even got past that stage. And then when they went to go move into television for Star Trek Phase 2, Matt Jefferies just happened to be working right above Gene Roddenberry on Little House on the Prairie, and he basically sort of got him to come on in a freelance basis because he couldn't leave his Little House on the Prairie job. To sort of recapture, like, well, if we're going back to TV, we might as well take the original design. And at that point, Ralph McQuarrie had moved on to Battlestar Galactica and Empire Strikes Back, so he wasn't available. So the idea that this design was somehow failed and killed, and that's a little bit of an exaggeration. It's
interesting, though, because it is quite a sort of Star Wars-y design. I mean, it does have that kind of echo of the Star Destroyers. It's got that real triangular shape to it. It's got that kind of hulking quality, and some of that we see a little bit in the Discovery, some of it maybe less so, but it is different, I suppose, to when you're talking about this kind of this line of ships that goes all the way through Star Trek. There is something about it that it does slightly, maybe it doesn't break the mold, but it certainly pushes that. But you can see it's a different artistic influence coming into it. It's a different vision in a sense of what that might be.
If you look at the Discovery, though, and the Enterprise D, I feel like those have bits and pieces more in common than perhaps the Enterprise D and the original series.
Right.
Because it has a more sort of triangular flatter engineering hull thing, with the neck connected and
That's
everything
true.
like that.
Yeah.
And the Discovery has the same sort of look, and even more so now. And John Eaves has sort of put his personal touch on it, which is basically having punch-outs through the hull. That's where things get really different.
Yeah.
You don't see that except for in pretty much anything that he's designed. There's in the Kelvin timeline, I think there's the Vengeance, and I don't know if John actually had any direct influence on that. But if you look at a lot of his kind of personal sketches and stuff for Star Trek, they have different pieces, and it could be that does something really cool, like maybe that helps like the inner ring separate or something like that, or because I know that the Nick Myers actually put out, Nick Myers' dog on Twitter put out a question
source of information.
Asking how long would a saucer separation take in the original series timeline, and that was months ago. So we're all like, it was funny how many people that I know and I jumped on that within and we all guesstimated it within a few seconds of the same time.
Oh, wow.
I felt good about that. I was like, okay. But that leads us to believe that possibly that they're going to be doing something, with the saucer
Something
separation.
interesting.
That doesn't mean that it's going to be Discovery, but so design-wise, it does bend the mold. I don't think it breaks the mold. If I looked at that ship, I would say, oh, it's from Star Trek.
Sure.
If you look at the Shenzhou, it looks like it's from Star Trek. It looks like it's more NX era, but
to me the Shenzhou looks it's I think maybe what it is about the Discovery, and I don't hate the Discovery design the way that some people do, but the thing that I get that I do slightly feel about the Ralph McQuarrie as well is that it feels quite flat compared to a lot of them. Do you know what I mean? There isn't that kind of empty space around, between the nacelles and the hull and so on. It maybe means it does feel less sort of aerodynamic because it works in space obviously, but it doesn't have that kind of bird-like wingspan kind of. Do you know what I mean? There's something about it. It has a slightly more solid feel to it. It feels heavier somehow. Does that make sense?
I still feel like we have not seen the final version because even in that last trailer, it looked really plasticky, and I can't imagine compared to some of the other, like if you look at that first shot when the Shenzhou is coming up out of the cloud bank into space, and you see like the delta on the planet underneath it. That looks visually like it's rendered so much better than that really quick thing going, like the Discovery going to warp, which looked super flat. It did not look. I don't know. It was the angle or something like that. And I know I've played around with drawing it quite a bit, and it's been changing over time. But I think there are quite a few really nice angles, and there are a few just like the top down. That makes it look really flat. It looks like a circle with a triangle. It looks like the IDIC symbol, as people have said.
Yeah, I think you were one of the people who managed to turn a lot of people's opinions on it around in a way because of a lot of the artwork that you've been putting out there that made people, after that first trailer, sort of see the beauty in that design a bit more somehow, that maybe they hadn't, because it had kind of freaked them out in various ways. It wasn't what they were expecting. Whereas, as you say, like by finding good angles for it and very... finding ways of showing that ship that, and the fact is, all the ship. I mean, like Voyager, for example, I think looks great from some angles and looks terrible from others.
And the nacelles look a little too short.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I never thought about that until back when Shar and Tristan were hosting To the Journey. They were doing an episode of what would Voyager be like if it was in the Kelvin universe, and so they had me draw a Kelvin. Voyager, and I made the beefy nacelles and stuff like that, and it was just like, this actually looks pretty decent on this ship. It was like it felt like it balanced something out that might have not been balanced, but that was actually that again is a direction from the studios, because there were it did not look like that originally. They had longer nacelles or other things. Basically, Rick Sternbach was given the edict to make essentially a Lexus. It's like make a sexy car ship. And so it became much more compact, more streamlined. I always thought it looked like a kind of like one of those spoons that you get inside of ice cream or yogurt that comes with it already. It's like it's got like it's a space spoon. With little nacelles on the back. And the idea that they wanted something that sort of moved back and forth, and he said, the in-universe kind of BS reason was that they changed the shape of the warp field so it didn't damage subspace for that one episode from TNG that everybody ignored after they did it. Yeah. So he goes, it was done. We never brought up why it does it. It just does it on the show, and there was no explanation whatsoever.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
But no, and it's interesting if you look at the bridge of Voyager and you go back to that very first pilot of Star Trek, the Cage. It has some similar color cues and stuff. It feels less dated than the bridge of the Enterprise from TNG.
Right, yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Next Gen Enterprise, because that, I suppose, was the big... Well, like you say, there was kind of a continuity from the motion picture, and I know Andrew Probert had been carried on from the motion picture, and then the other big character who comes in at that point for pretty much all of Star Trek leading on from that period is Herman Zimmerman, and between them they were kind of responsible for the look, I think, of the Enterprise D. He came and went, I think, a lot, but he was, I think, for each of the successive... Well, except for Voyager, actually, he was sort of there at the beginning of Next Gen, DS9, and even Enterprise. If you look at some of those early sketches of the Enterprise D, it's kind of interesting, because obviously we think of it as, compared to the original Enterprise, it's very... it's bigger, it's more luxurious. They've got, an arboretum. They've got it's got this quite sort of comfortable feel. But some of the original sketches went even further, because they wanted to get away from this idea of the bridge as this kind of military command center. And there are sketches where there's kind of benches where people can just sit and kind of look out the window almost. There's like a spiral staircase going up to a balcony, and so it's this weird idea of kind of combining the military side with this, I suppose, with this ship that has families on board and that has all of that. And it's funny because then, when you get to the actual show, although the bridge design is very, is in keeping with that, it is, they've got this very luxurious leather armchairs and so on. But at the same time, there's this very much this feel of like, you don't come to the bridge unless you're asked to come to the bridge. Do you know what I mean? And if someone comes in and sits in the captain's chair, or, there are these, there's this real kind of, partly because Picard is quite a stickler and quite a sort of traditional authoritarian captain in a sense, there's this kind of respect for it. There are things that you do and don't do on that bridge, even though it seems quite kind of... the design is relaxed, but the mood is, is a bit more formal in some ways, at least when the captain's around.
And it is kind of interesting. Compared to, like, say, the original series, it feels like there is less seating. And I know some of that is because, like, the chairs sort of push into the panels in the wall, so you can kind of pull them out, and they just sort of... that space becomes... But it feels like a couch and two chairs, a big screen TV, and a lot of empty space to walk around in. Yeah, it's like sometimes it feels a little, and it might just be because I've seen the sets like mocked up in person, and then you see where in television when you shoot, everything gets much smaller, and you have to get people to sit really close together because it looks like they're massively far away. So it's very interesting, the malleability of the size of these sets depending on how you experience them. So for the real actual people there, sometimes I would imagine the set would feel, or if this was a real bridge, it would feel some kind of claustrophobic. But then you see it on screen and it's very open, and like I said, you have to get the people to physically be really close to each other so it doesn't look like they're half a room away. Yeah. It's just the way the camera shoots. It's a really interesting effect.
It definitely feels very kind of comfortable. I mean, it does look almost like... I think I've seen like a fan who built a home cinema, basically, based on that bridge. And there is almost that element of it, with the armchairs and this kind of... And also in the first... Certainly the first season, I can't remember if they have them in the second season, but the chairs at the front, which recline at this kind of almost impossible angle. It's like you're basically practically asleep, Aaron is doing it as we speak on my screen and disappearing off the bottom of the screen.
Or the battle bridge, kind of, the same thing. It was just like, that was ridiculous. I'm like, are you just going to lay flat and look at the ceiling? It's like, what's going on?
They're going to slide down onto the floor somehow. And then also, because you've got the kind of, instead of having steps going down, which you have on most of the other ships, you've got this ramp. So you've got this kind of this roundness, you've got this horseshoe shape, and then you've got this kind of ramp coming down. And you notice it, obviously, when you go to yesterday's Enterprise and they have steps instead, you see what impact that has somehow. That the fact that it's a ramp, it makes it feel more relaxed, it makes it feel more kind of pleasant and sort of enjoyable space, as opposed to somewhere a bit more edgy and a bit more kind of hard-edged.
If you look at the the 3D virtual tour that somebody constructed of the Enterprise, there actually is steps leading up to the bridge, though, from the level below it, which is interesting. You can take a turbo lift, but you can also walk up these stairs that I guess where you enter like the side of the screens, like
opposite the ready room. Do you mean there's that door on the sort of bottom left that never seems to get used? Yeah.
That's like their stair, which I guess I'm assuming is because if the turbo lift goes down, you can walk down.
You can take the stairs.
I don't know.
There could be a lot of stairs.
I was thinking, you could just turn off the gravity and float where you wanted to go. That would make things a lot easier, but they never did that because of budget, obviously. I always thought that was funny. It was just like in Disaster, it's like everything on the ship is just completely shut down or going haywire, but your gravity's fine. Okay. Yeah. That is the most that we have to say that the gravity systems in Starfleet are the most reliable piece of technology they have.
The other thing, of course, that people often say about the Enterprise D is that it feels like a hotel or a kind of conference center or something. And in fact,
dentist office in space is what we called it in the 80s.
Yeah. Well, Matt Jefferies himself, who designed the original Enterprise, he said Gene Roddenberry asked him to watch Next Gen, and he watched it, and he said they've taken the bridge of my ship and turned it into the lobby of the Hilton, and he never watched it after that. He obviously was quite annoyed about it. And there is that kind of feel of, it feels very kind of corporate. You've got somewhere between a hotel and like a conference centre. You've got the carpet on the floor. You've even got those kind of carpet panels on the walls. Yep. You've got these big like oak, like the big conference tables, and even the horseshoe, of course, has that kind of, it's quite, it's sort of attractive.
All it's missing is a conference phone in the center of the table. And it's like, it's like, all right, are you there? Are you on? Yeah, okay. Yeah. Who do you have on your end? It's like, we've got Barb and we've got, like whoever's like,
exactly.
It just feels very much like every meeting that I've ever gone to with a client.
Yeah. And it's appropriate because, Next Gen is that. It is very much a show of the 80s and the kind of early 90s. It is, the conference is that's what they do. When there's a crisis, they all sit around the table and debate it together. And, and in some ways we can kind of poke fun at that. But, on the other hand, that is a part of the charm of the show, and it's part of the kind of ethos of the show, that it is about a kind of collaborative. It's not just the captain. It's not Captain Kirk saying we're going to take, risk is our business. I'm going to make. I know when he says that speech, he's saying he wants the support of the other people, but that's kind of exceptional in a sense. Whereas for Picard, it's totally normal that you would sit around and get everyone's opinion, and then you'd make your decision, and that is kind of reflected in that kind of different approach to the design in a sense.
Well, what's interesting is that if TNG is the 80s, Voyager is very much a .com company. It's like, it's collaborative. It's, nobody has the assigned roles that they normally would. It's like sort of breaking down. Like, I look at how advertising used to be in the 80s. If you're going to use this as like from my viewpoint from working in design, and it's like the TNG was McCann Erickson, big New York advertising agency. Voyager is the small company that I worked at in LA. That's sort of like it's a flat structure almost. Yes, you still have a captain, but everybody seems to be very collaborative. There's, the beginning of text messaging, if you notice that, sort of like on the bridge, they would send messages to each other, and there was much more,
it's like an open plan,
communication and
open plan, hot desking kind of office.
Yeah,
I always feel like that when B'Elanna comes up to the bridge and she has that station over there. You kind of, I don't know. There's definitely, and that sense there's sort of, which is more like the original series in a sense, with all these stations all the way around the outside. But you're right, it feels more.
If we're sort of talking social structure, comparing like the Hilton-y, businessy, go 80s yuppie sort of feel. This definitely felt to me like a .com era sort of And then you get into Enterprise, and it's sort of like, who knows at that point? You know, it's like it's a throwback,
very much
but it's
submarine kind of design influence there. I mean, the other thing that obviously was brought in with Next Gen, which had a huge influence on Star Trek going forward, was the accoutrograms and the kind of touchscreen interface and that whole kind of, you know, basically moving away from these kind of glowing, you know, jelly buttons and that kind of
And that was for,
interface.
you know, like all things in Star Trek, money. It was that we just couldn't afford to have like all these different moving parts and switches, and so they
really?
basically,
Right, okay. But it feels quite futuristic, and I mean, the weird thing is now, you know,
If
these
they had
days
buttons,
we have
it would have been
touchscreens on our
weird.
phones, on our computers. You know, it doesn't seem so far-fetched, but at the time, touchscreen technology was... I mean, I remember my aunt used to work for Microsoft, and she designed a program for the National Gallery in London, which was basically, you know, it's like you go to the museum and it was a touchscreen program all about their artworks, essentially, that they were designing, and you know, and then like the idea that you could press the screen and it would tell you something about this particular painting or whatever was completely revolutionary. So that seemed like something from the future at the time.
Well, the two sizes of iPhones and iPads are the sizes of the devices that they carried around with them, basically.
Yeah, and all these things, you know, and partly that is
Floppy
because that's the future. You know, that if you grow up with the part of the future is a communicator that flips open, then that's what you want when you're, you know, if you're designing something that's futuristic and kind of aspirational and kind of high tech in that way, you're playing on
sort
that.
of a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
It is, exactly. It's completely a self-fulfilling prophecy. But those accoutrograms, I think they did a really good job of making it seem, and I know this is something that you've talked about in relation to Discovery, and obviously we don't quite know where that's going ultimately, but that it feels like a real operating system. We might not know exactly how it works, but it's kind of believable that, you know, more frankly than all those glowing buttons are, it's kind of believable that you could control the ship through this system if you just knew what to press.
It reconfigures. That's where it's like, it's not the same panel every time. Yeah. And it's funny because I worked on Star Trek Online, helping to convert the desktop version to the console. And I talked with Mike Okuda because I was just like, you know, it's like I'm basically taking LCARS and making it a functional user interface, which is funny because it was never designed to be that. You know, he said, you know, you make it look good for TV, and if it could function, that's great. I'm like, so I said, I jokingly said, yeah, I curse your name every time I go to sleep and close my eyes, and all I'm seeing is the LCARS system because. You know, it's like I'm trying to make it actual function, and like, okay, if I click this, then this will open up this panel and do that, and so the funny thing is that it has enough structure to it that we were able to make it a usable interface.
Right.
It would maybe not be the end point if we were starting from scratch, but it definitely works. And you know, you had mentioned the Discovery interface. We haven't seen much of it, but what we have seen. That's the one thing I'm disappointed, I guess I would say, in because it feels very much like Tony Stark's heads-up display with just like every bit of information thrown at you with no discernible structure. And they even had, when you see the photon torpedoes, they're represented with bullets, like 21st century video game bullets, not photon torpedo shaped bullets. I don't understand. I'm hoping that that's like placeholder for the trailer, and that when we actually see the interface, it'll feel more Federation, Star Trek. You know, because I think there is a way to take the visuals from TOS, which are physical blinking, flashing buttons, take some of those color cues, take some of the structure of it, and then convert that into more of an interface screen or something like that. And I don't think that that's beyond the possibility of the designer's ability. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, which they started to do in Enterprise, actually, didn't they? In terms of the colours and so on. I mean, I know the Okudas were quite involved in that. Was very subtly kind of moving towards those things. Yeah. So yeah, I guess you go from the Enterprise to the Next Generation, the Enterprise D, and in a way there's quite a clear line going through into Voyager, and a lot of the sets from Voyager were repurposed elements from that ship. You know, if the Enterprise D is the Hilton in space, Voyager is a kind of, you know, a reconfiguration of that. In a sense, all the Federation starships to some degree are kind of Hiltons in space. But obviously with Deep Space Nine, you get a different opportunity because this is an alien space station, so there's an opportunity to kind of show something about the character of those people, of the Cardassians who've created this place. And it's quite interesting, actually. I was rewatching Emissary this week, and Sisko actually makes a point about the design. When he first arrives in Ops, he looks up to his office, and he says, the prefect's put his office way up at the top, so everyone has to look up to him. So it kind of, even in the design there's this idea of this very authoritarian regime, almost like a kind of, it's a bit like the panopticon, the idea of this person in the position of authority where they can kind of look down and observe everyone else. And in other ways, I guess that space station, it kind of echoes these, the fact the Cardassians they're not really into comfort. They're not wearing pajamas. They're wearing those, awful, their uniforms look incredibly uncomfortable. They're so rigid and hard and kind of, and their design kind of reflects that. We get in the episode Melora with the woman in a wheelchair, and she complains that all their doors have these huge lips on them, that it's the opposite of the kind of user friendly Enterprise D environment where everyone feels comfortable and could lounge around on a sofa. It's kind of inhospitable.
Well, even the Doctor in Voyager, when he was going through the Jefferies tubes, was trying to figure out where to get somewhere. He's like, okay, you turn left, you turn right, you do this. It's like, and then he's like, who designed this ship? So it's like, so I think every design probably has that sort of thing, but definitely Deep Space Nine, so many things, and there are all these, emergency systems and systems to keep the Bajoran slave workers in check. We had recently watched, we pulled up Civil Defense.
Oh yeah,
watch that.
Yeah,
and there was a lot of that sort of stuff too. It's like there are all these redundant systems that probably you would have to take the whole system, whole station apart to even find all of these layers of paranoia basically built into this space station. So it's really interesting. They was reading up on the first Cardassian ships and how they were sort of like Ankh shaped. They're very Egyptian, and it was sort of playing to the whole idea of the Cardassians as the slaveholders to the Bajoran. Basically it's sort of the pharaohs and the slaves,
right?
And it had a little bit of that influence in there, and that sort of carries into the Cardassian design. And I feel like the Bajorans are sort of like a mirror of that on the other side. It's like the rounded. It feels like it has similar elements, but just softened. And I don't think they ever had. They obviously had interaction. In fact, that they were taken over. But I don't know, before that there was the occupation, was there any kind of back and forth between these people? Because we had the episode with the light ship, the solar sail.
Yeah.
We find out that ancient Bajorans actually did visit Cardassia, so they must be close by in space sense.
And that light ship is very kind of airy. It's basically got sails. It's a kind of it's the opposite of that kind of solid, beautiful, stodgy kind of really beautiful design. Yeah. And the Bajorans generally, they wear. I mean, you think of the monks and so on. They wear these robes. They're kind of like Buddhist style
Opera
robes
House on their head.
And they have. If you think about again in Emissary, I think you have Kayapaka's monastery. There's a lot of like pools of water. There's kind of the design of the buildings is quite kind of round and sort of soft in that way, and there is definitely that sense, although they've been hardened by occupation and they have become these quite tough. I mean, Kira is not a soft character at all.
No.
But at the same time, they're sort of natural society, maybe, they're that kind of cliche of the artists and the farmers and the kind of...
agrarian, definitely.
Exactly, sort of...
pastoral.
Yeah, kind of, almost like the people in Insurrection. Do you know what I mean? That kind of like...
Yeah, I kind of flashed to that for a second. That we always joke that the Insurrection, the Baku village is actually... the outlet mall that is down in Camarillo, California, because it has that sort of like, I'm just waiting to see the sign for like Nike and Gap around the corner, because it just has a very, it was constructed for and it was probably roughly in the same location. It was out in that area. It felt very. I commend them that they actually made this whole physical village, but it did feel like it was just sort of plopped down whole cloth and sort of.
It feels like a set is the problem somehow. It doesn't
it's a great set, but it's not lived in, and that's why
exactly. Yeah,
I think Deep Space Nine managed to for a television show, make it feel lived in. It felt like it had existed. And even when you look at like the Bajoran stuff, like when Kira goes to her friend who became a farmer, and they were trying to get him off the land or whatever because they needed to
Shakar,
yeah. That looked lived in. I mean, that looked 100 times more real than the Baku village, which is kind of odd.
It's interesting, yeah. Well, maybe just moving on. So we talked a bit about DS9 and Voyager. I guess in some ways we can take everything since then as variations on a theme, in the sense that everything that has been done since then has been a prequel. One way or another, it's this question of going back to some point before the original series. Enterprise was 100 years before the original series. The JJ universe is, strictly speaking, like 5 years before the original series, isn't it? In terms of their 5-year mission is out of sync.
Right.
So although it's really a reboot, but you can kind of just about turn that as a prequel. And Discovery obviously is a prequel as well. Again, quite close to that time period. But so with all these sort of iterations of Star Trek, there's this real question of like, how do you deal with something as iconic as the original series in design, and how do you kind of reference that, or how do you fit into that? How do you do something with more up-to-date technology that somehow feels like it could be earlier in time than that 50-year-old, 40 or 50-year-old show?
Right. Well, I strictly speaking, you probably can't. I mean, 100%. There's no way, unless you make the show as if it's a historical drama and you are trying to recreate the flashy bleaky buttons and I think that if you wanted to like really replicate the communicator from the Cage, which is that sort of lucite plastic that looks like it has maybe phone or radio pieces in it with the flip up thing, you could reimagine that, where the lucite plastic is sort of like the phones in The Expanse, which is sort of this clear thing until you turn it on, and then it's got the buttons on the screen, and you could maybe take the things that are there and then put another layer on top of it that we just didn't see when we saw it originally, or something like that. Like, oh, we never knew that this screen could turn on and do these things. But that would be a little silly. So I think you just have to capture the energy and the feeling of that era, and not necessarily the exact design of it. I mean, I think there is probably a more medium ground between what they did with Discovery and the original series. I think you could make the ships look a bit more TOS era. You could have rounded nacelles instead of the sort of whatever kind of squished rectangular sort of things that they're doing. It's not that it's bad, it is different, and I know that's going to, and it has obviously bothered a lot of people, because you can't go into a forum online without hearing how everything's been destroyed. But they also seem to be equating a change in design with that. Then that means also that the entirety of the show is going to be completely different. It's just going to be zap, zap, shoot 'em. There's going to be no moral messages. The people who put this show together aren't fans, which is, if you follow the people who are putting Discovery together in any form or fashion, you know that these people are huge fans. I have a conversation with one of the writers. Yeah. I mentioned like an obscure thing from the animated series. He responded, we kept talking, and I realized only later that it was like, I would have had to explain that to 99% of Star Trek fans, yet this person knew that. So it's like they know their stuff. They, have been fans for a long time. Not everybody, obviously, but I think that you kind of have to separate story from visuals sometimes, which is hard in Star Trek, because sometimes the story is a little weak and you have just the, ooh, isn't that cool alien or whatever,
I think it's difficult also because, all we've seen, we see trailers which are cut to emphasize action and so on, and also because people have been kind of burned by the JJ verse films. I mean, I know lots of people love the JJ verse films, but whether you love them or hate them, they are a very action-packed, I was going to say, version of Star Trek, or arguably not. Lots of people say they're not Star Trek, but they're very different beasts. And I suppose the anxiety was going into Discovery. Are they? And this big anxiety: is it Prime or is it Kelvin? A lot of that is about how are we just going to get that kind of relentless pace of the JJ movies 15 times over on a kind of weekly basis, or are we going to get something that feels more like Star Trek? And I guess we just have to kind of trust that, like you said, the writers and so everyone involved seems to be aware of those kind of issues and seems to know what they're doing. And maybe what we get isn't what we are used to, but it's not going to be it's not going to be Into Darkness. Touch wood.
And I don't want it to be exactly like what I want. I mean, that's when you get exactly what you expect, then it's just I mean, I want something that's going to challenge my idea of what Star Trek is to a point. I don't want Game of Thrones, but I also don't want storytelling circa 1987. I don't need TNG. I don't need the Orville, which is basically what I think the Orville is shooting for, replicating a 30-year-old style of storytelling, which is fine, and that's really cool, but that's not what Star Trek should be. Star Trek, I think, for me, feels like what Walt Disney wanted Disneyland to be, like always developing, always changing. And I think Gene, with all the different iterations that he was involved with, you could see it. It had the core idea was still there, but TNG is very different than TOS. But so was Gene at that point. He had changed, and so and obviously once you reach the point of a human lifespan, if the show is going to continue, the show is going to change because the same people just can't be involved anymore because they're not around.
I mean, I think with Enterprise, just from a visual point of view, they did find their own look, and maybe the way they did it, which surprised a lot of people at the time, and people, have taken a while to sort of adjust to, is that rather than it seeming like a prequel to the original series, a lot of people said this, it was more like it was closer to our own time. So the universe, the costumes, they kind of look like NASA costumes. So the ship looked like something, much more kind of nuts and boltsy than the kind of stuff we'd seen in the original series. I mean, by the time you get to the Kelvin verse and the JJ films, you've got this. That's the. I mean, people talk about not liking Discovery. That's the aesthetic that really doesn't work for me, because it's this kind of souped up, ramped up. I mean, it fits those films, this sort of version of that original series aesthetic, but just pushed to slightly ludicrous degrees. I think, like the sense of scale, it doesn't feel like Star Trek to me, the sense of scale in those films. You have those huge engineering sets. You have those nacelles. I know some people love those nacelles. To me, they're a massive turn-off. They just look ridiculous. They look like...
Well, engineering is a brewery. A brewery I literally pass on the freeway when I'm driving to the doctor's office. So it's I don't need that. That always bothered me, but that's but me. Also, it's just that design. I think it's apparently J.J. Abrams said he wanted the ship to look like a hot rod. It is like someone painting a stripe down the side of their car and thinking it looks cool. Do you know what I mean? It looks showy-offy to me. It doesn't look. It's not graceful. It's not. There's a sophistication to that original Matt Jefferies design that I think is lost once you start messing around with it in that way, because it's just for me it's sort of a tweak too far. It doesn't feel right. It would be interesting kind of going into Discovery, because one of the things, I mean, just thinking about the design, we haven't seen very much of the interior design of the Federation ships, but we've seen, I guess, quite a bit with the Klingon ship. And obviously the Klingons have been quite controversial, the fact they look quite different. But not only do they look different in terms of their costumes, in terms of their makeup and so on, but the design of that ship, from what we've seen, is very elaborate, very ornate. It looks like a cathedral. I was looking at Mark Worthington, who's the designer. I was having a look at some of his previous work. He did a lot of American Horror Story, which I haven't seen, and frankly have no intention of seeing. It looks truly horrifying, which I guess is the point. But some of the designs he did for that, there was a season that was set in a hotel, and the hotel again is very kind of ornate, very sort of quite kind of gothic, and kind of huge vaulting ceilings and so on. You can definitely see, looking at some of his previous work, that element of grandeur and scale, and I suppose stuff that you wouldn't traditionally be able to do on a TV budget. Yeah, when you look at this, it is pretty amazing that
it looks cinematic, it looks grand, and that will... It'll be interesting to see. As I say, we haven't seen much of it. How does that play into the interior of the ships that we're going to be presumably spending the most time on the Federation ships?
Right.
Because because again, they've got that kind of prequel thing. They can't make them, you know, if it was the Enterprise J or whatever, they could have a, you know, vast, you know, huge spaces everywhere. Right. But given that it's the Enterprise J around the same time as, well, yeah, the Enterprise J is a weird. Yeah,
the Enterprise J was made like in a day too. I think that
you can tell that
Doug Drexler had mentioned. It's like, well, we need a ship, and he's like, here, it's a big ship. You know, it's like,
and then of course it ends up as a model. I mean, that's the weird thing. Is like with the Eagle Moss models and so on, something like that. I mean, I haven't actually. I've seen pictures of the model. I don't have that model, but that seems like an example of something that. I don't know whether that's kind of bringing it into reality slightly a bit too much by physicalizing it in that way, and it doesn't feel believable.
There is so much. This could be like a 17-part series. You could go through each show and talk about the influence. Like something we had talked about off air is that like the early Enterprise designs. I found some manned orbiting laboratory, which was this kind of top secret U.S. Air Force space station that was going to be built and then was declassified, and they had the viewers that Spock has, the one where he puts his eyes into the, you know, so there are a lot of elements from, you know, actual space technology that has worked its way in pretty much every iteration of Star Trek. If you look at the uniforms for Skylab, there's a lot of the tones and colors that worked its way into some of the browner uniforms that were in the motion picture. So it was like
right.
They're just all these little touchstones, and it works the other way around. You know, you have influences, like you said, with the phone, iPad. There's just all these different things from Star Trek. Haircut styles, I'm sure at some point, you know, like you've got the sideburns and you know. So it all kind of folds in on itself, which is really interesting. It's like how this show that, you know, if you really think about it, it's a TV show. And I know it's like, it does mean a lot, and it does have a lot of important issues. Like, but it's not real. No. But it is, because the way it actually influences me. There are people who would not be scientists and would not be doctors, and, you know, or designers even. Like I credit seeing the Ralph McQuarrie, Ken Adam ship that has now become the Discovery for being in Los Angeles. If I had not seen the article in Starlog magazine where they interviewed Ralph McQuarrie and didn't realize that, oh wow, if I grow up, I can actually, you know, be this thing. Ships don't just come out of nowhere, you know, obviously, like, but when you're 7 or 8, you don't know that. Mm-hmm. It's like, so wow, this is a job. I could do this. And that sort of set me on my path to ending up where I'm at.
And that's one of the great things about Star Trek, I think, is it does feel real compared to a lot of science fiction. It feels believable. It feels like a world. And because of the way it's designed, it is quite appealing. I mean, generally speaking, even Deep Space Nine, which, you know, is dark and a bit, you know, grungy and so on. You know, once they've got their furniture in and they've kind of exactly. You know, it's kind of, you could imagine living there. It'd be kind of fun. Yeah. And, you know, certainly like the Enterprise D, it'd be a very comfortable, you know, it would be a nice hotel to stay at for a few weeks anyway. And I think that is a part of the charm. Is that
you can do the Airbnb or whatever, just like,
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, yeah, that'd be great. I mean, you know, and I think that is part of the appeal of Star Trek, is that it's you know, it's a future that we'd like to live in on a kind of moral, ethical, do you know what I mean? Like it's a good future for humanity in that sense, but it's also quite an appealing world in terms of design. It's quite, you know, it'd be a nice place to be. It'd be a nice future to live in. And so it's not surprising in a sense that would feed into our real world design, and that we start, you know, building that around us in the things that we design in the real world. So, Aaron, if people listening to this want to find out more about you, or get in touch, or hear more of your podcasts on the network, what's the best way for them to find you?
You can find me on Twitter under the user GeekFilter, and you can pretty much put that into any social media. That'll be my username. And I'm always in the Babel Conference. That's our Facebook users group. And you can hear me on Saturday Morning Trek, which is our animated series and all things Trek in the 1970s podcast. And I'm also co-host of The Edge, which is our Discovery podcast. So you can hear us talking about design on that show as well. And hopefully we'll be having some of the designers, you know, when the embargo and all of this has been broken, they'll be joining us for some Q&A and you know, answers to our questions about why things turned out the way they did and stuff, and should be interesting.
Definitely. And also, of course, you can see a lot of Aaron's work on the show art for the different shows, on various other artworks to do with the network. He's the one producing those great images, and including many great images of the Discovery, which, as I say, I think have really helped to bring around fans to that design that maybe was something that they were struggling with. So in a sense, if that's the design that got you into design, you've kind of paid back in a way by getting other people into it as well, by sharing that kind of enthusiasm.
That's probably one of my proudest, like people are just like, I don't like the ship, or I didn't like the ship until I saw your poster, or I don't necessarily like what I've seen, but I can see that there is possibilities, and I'm going to give it a chance. Just I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
definitely. Well, it's been fun talking about design in the Star Trek universe this week, Aaron, but that's not the only thing that we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So here's a look at some of the other things you can find out about on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Literary Treks.
Oh, Matthew, I'm doing just fine. It's always fun every week to hop on here and talk Star Trek books and comics with you. And I don't know if you realize this, Matthew, but this is our 200th episode of Literary... Wait a minute, Matthew. We don't host this show anymore.
The 602 Club.
I honestly was thrilled with the way that they set it up because, like you said, sort of like Russian dolls, I guess, is a good way to explain it. You introduce one character in this existing show, and then it leads to that character's own show, which leads to the next one's own show.
The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
There were a lot of comments talking about this roller coaster ride. Yay, I'm so excited Trek's on. Oh, it's a prequel. I saw the first trailer and I loved it. Oh, Brian Fuller's no longer working on it. Oh, we're getting all this diversity. Oh, look at the Klingons, right? And you could just see it. Seriously, some fans have gone through some serious roller coaster rides.
To the journey!
And so I could see the Hirogen viewing themselves as very noble, very civilized. They don't let their prey suffer, but really they're doing these horrific things, just like we do here in the real world when we have to go fight wars.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they go home and they write an epic poem about it, and that makes it okay.
the Hirogen equivalent of Beowulf. Right?
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out all of these shows and join in the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published. And please do leave us a star rating and a written review at the same time. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. If you'd also like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm, that's patreon.com/trekfm, to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, the Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate any support you can give us, and we hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. Duncan and I would love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to get involved and do just that. The best place to join in the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. You can find Duncan and I on the Babel Conference as well, and you can find us both on Twitter, Duncan at Barrett's Books, and myself, Tony, at Black Hole Media. And you can also find me hosting my own podcast, the Xcast and X-Files podcast, if you type that into Twitter and Facebook. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of Primitive Culture. We'll be back soon to discuss more history, culture, and how Star Trek relates to it.
You're blended, all right.